Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sunil Badami. I'll be your host this afternoon. But before we begin, Cause and Effect would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, their elders past and present of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where we stand, and the place where at least one Prime Minister acknowledged the desolation and dispossession and destruction of them and their culture, our culture. How many Indian mothers does it take to change a light bulb? I hear you not asking. Don't mind me. I'll just sit here in the dark while I pray to God for you to give me 2 grandsons who become cardiologists in America. When I got my first short story published in the venerable literary journal Meanjin many years ago, the thrill of being published for the first time was not matched by what they paid me. And so when I gave my mother a copy of the magazine and asked if I could borrow $20 for the electricity, that's how long ago it was, she looked at me as kindly as she could and said, "You know, I really don't know why you persist in living this writer's cliche of drunkenness, dissolution and debauchery, only to become famous 100 years after you die. Why don't you break the cliche and start a family? I'm not getting any younger, you know." And I have to admit, it's a question I have often asked myself as I get older. You know, I've just recently gotten a new job working in advertising. And it struck me how much more I am paid to write something that sells something than I ever got paid to write something that said something. And it's a question I guess a lot of us who may be working in the arts and trying not necessarily to tell anyone anything or even say something, but just ask the questions that we increasingly see are not being asked in the news or in Parliament or on social media or in most public discourse, where it's less a conversation or a dialogue than a shouting match between arseholes and weirdos. Speaking of which, I know you know the drill. This is where I would say, please remember to turn your phones off. But don't turn your phones off. If you are tweeting or Instagramming, don't forget that the hashtag is hashtag Vivid Ideas, hashtag 107 Redfern, and hashtag Cause Effect. By my calculation, should leave you 107 characters for a pithy, retweetable quote. It's interesting, isn't it, when so much news today is considered to be fake, or surmise, or simply opinion. When so much history is revisionist or debatable, depending on what side of the argument you stand, that often it's hard to know what the facts are, much less the truth, with everybody shouting, and so few of us listening. And I've often, call me biased, but I've often thought that even if news gave us a story or history gave us the facts, it wasn't enough to just know. Art was always the thing that helped me understand, whether it was myself or my society or my country or my place in any of them, including myself, that I could see in the stories of those who were not like me, separated from me by distance or time, a little of myself, and more importantly, understand a little bit of what they may be feeling or thinking or experiencing. Alexis Wright once said that authenticity is a condition imposed upon those of us who may look or dress or love a little bit differently to the supposed norm. Authenticity is a condition imposed upon us by those in the least position to judge. And I know that there's many of us today here who have often struggled with the need or the imposition of having to justify our right to speak. It's interesting that those of us whose voices aren't heard on 2GB, whose faces aren't seen on Channel 7, 9, 10, 2, pretty much, most of Foxtel, Sky News, those of us whose opinions or voices or thoughts aren't heard in boardrooms or in Parliament are often told to remember our place whenever we say something that isn't the thing we're expected to say. Where do we find a place for us? Where do we find a country without borders, without closed doors, in backroom clubs? For me, it's been art. Rebecca Solnit once said that a book is the thing that you say, or the something that you say to the someone who is no one, the thing that you can't say to anyone, even yourself. And as a writer of fiction, I found there's not as many people willing to hear what I've got to say as opposed to those who like to hear what Kim Kardashian doesn't have to say. I look at the video that we were playing before about all the racism and inequity and devastation caused by war and environmental neglect, by the uncaring and selfishness, the anger and the fear that seems to be churning up the world in a way I never thought it could. I thought technology would make everything easier, although I am still waiting for my jetpack. I thought that the internet would connect us rather than separate and divide us. I thought that by having computers and robots do all these things for us, we could start concentrating on the things that united us. With all this extra time, we could somehow find a way to let the machines do the drudgery while we work towards, I guess, the ideal we all have of humanity, humaneness. And yet I find that everywhere man is free but still chained to the Wi-Fi network or the signal. And no, I don't know what the password is here. And I've often wondered, what is art able to do? And increasingly it seems to be nothing more than an investment held in secretive air-conditioned free ports in Geneva and Singapore for billionaire hedge fund managers who plunge the world into the uncertainty and iniquity of the great financial crisis, global financial crisis, to simply move around between lockers on the basis of their appreciation. The tax ameliorated in a Dutch sandwich between Barbados and Ireland. Art that will never be seen. They estimate to be 30 or 40% of all the art produced between the 17th century and the 20th. Simply to hang on a wall, or worse still, in a locker. No one, least of all us, or our children, will ever see it, any more than our children may ever see the Great Barrier Reef. It's hashtag 107 Redfern, hashtag vivid ideas, hashtag cause and effect. The first novel was about a guy deluded, foolish, mad, tilting at windmills. But that didn't make Don Quixote any less heroic. And I like to think that artists, especially today, when the government can decide to whom it bestows its largesse based on whether it thinks you agree with them or not, whether it thinks your art or what you have to say is of any value or not. I like to think that those of us in the arts are quixotic in the best sense of the word. I don't think anyone should suffer for their art, least of all my children for my art, which is why I work in advertising. But it doesn't mean I don't try to imbue the work that I do with the same spirit of hope that what I do, whether it's in my paid work or my real work, can somehow connect me, us, to each other, to find that common thread of humanity, of soul. It's easy to believe that it's just pictures or movement or made-up stories, but they belie a truth we all know if we put our phones down and stop watching the ticker for whatever kafefe means. Bad art often purports to tell us the answer, just as stupid politicians often think that there are simple solutions to complex problems. I like to think that great art just poses a new way of asking the question, and hopefully questions we in the press and rush of life may not have actually considered before. In that still meditative moment when we're either making it or appreciating it, we can find that little clarity, that speck of truth, that infinity in a grain of sand that makes us realise that we are more than an arts grant or a bottom line or growth figures. Well, if you're looking for a way to ask the question in interesting and innovative ways, you're in the right place. Today we have 8 amazingly talented speakers, artists, dancers, the list goes on. In fact, by comparison, I think I'm, well, just an adequate speller. Or according to my mother, still not a dermatologist. We'll be talking about how art can impact the lives of those who are most vulnerable, most voiceless. How we can find ways to spread that humanity in the most hopeless corners. And how art can be an agent for change. It's interesting, isn't it? Because when we think of all the great cultures, the great civilizations of the world, we never remember their sewerage plants and their banks. We remember their art. That is the monument they leave when feet left in the endless plains are blown over by sand. That is what speaks to us across the ages, across cultures, across languages and borders. And today we will find out, hopefully, how that may happen